the Viking secret that kept them from ever sinking. That was what Halfdan muttered into the frost-laden dark, his cracked lips barely moving as the words caught in the fur of his hood. It was not a boast now, not the way it had sounded on the pebble beach at Kaupang when the ship first slid into the fjord, black-hulled and proud. Here, deep in the northern forest, the words had the weight of a charm, or a plea to gods who might be listening from beyond the jagged, ice-crusted treetops. He drew a breath that seared the back of his throat, tasting pine smoke and the faint iron of his own bleeding gums. Snow whispered down through the firs in dry, brittle flakes that did not melt on his fur cloak. The cold was so complete that it felt like the world had turned to bone. Around him, the longhouse was no longhouse at all, but a low, sunken pit they had hacked into the earth, roofed with turf and lashed poles. It smelled of smoke, wet leather, and men whose beards held the sour crust of dried sweat and fish oil. 10 of them crouched there in the glow of the hearth's coals, their shields stacked like broken lids against the walls, swords dull with frost. Rollo scraped a strip of dried cod with his teeth, lips blue, his shoulders shivering in spasms he could not control. The fire hissed as a drop of meltwater fell from the roof, and every head jerked up at the sound. In this forest, every sound mattered. Halfdan's fingers found the edge of the shipnail he wore around his neck, a charm hammered from the rivets of the gnar that had carried them here. That was the secret, he told himself. The ships, the way they were built, the way they rode the sea like living things. The carved oak strakes overlapped like fish scales. The tarred wool and horsehair caulking swelled tight in the salt water, and the hull flexed with the waves instead of breaking. They never sank. Not in the fjords. Not in the storms that had turned Frankish traders white with terror. That memory was all that kept the pounding of his heart from breaking into a panic he would never name aloud. The snow outside had buried their sledges and the stripped skeletons of 2 reindeer they had eaten 3 days ago. The Byamians had not shown themselves for 2 nights now, and that was worse than arrows. No one could sleep for more than a few heartbeats at a time. A man's head would nod toward his chest, and then some faint crunch or whistle of wind in the frozen pines would drag his eyes wide again. Bjarki, the oldest, spat into the fire. The saliva froze on the edge of the embered log, hissing weakly. "They watch," he said in a voice like split wood. "The forest has eyes, better the sea than this." Halfdan followed his gaze to the low entrance, where a pelt hung against the drifted snow. Beyond it, the forest waited, its silence like a jaw about to close. He had seen the forest claim their first scout 3 days past. A smear of blood on the snow, a line of fox tracks leading nowhere, and then nothing. No corpse, no gear. Only the heavy stillness of the pines and the uncanny sense that their own breaths were too loud. They had come for furs, for the pale pelts that fetched silver in Hedeby and Burka, for the soft winter coats of sable and fox and the white stoats that nobles wrapped around their throats. They had thought the Byamians, if they even existed outside of stories, would be ragged hunters eager to trade. That was before the first night, when the darkness filled with noises that were not wolf nor wind. Hollow knocks, a hiss like air blown through bone, and then the sudden silent death of a man who had gone to piss by the tree line. The hearth spat, and someone flinched. Rollo muttered a half-remembered prayer to Thor, thumb brushing the edge of his sayax. The smell of unwashed bodies, singed wool and wood smoke thickened until it made the throat ache. Hunger crawled in all their bellies. The last porridge of barley and pine bark had gone cold at dawn. Halfdan thought of home. The longhouse by the fjord, smoke rising through the hole in the roof, the weight of his daughter asleep across his chest, the steady lap of tide under the floorboards. There the ship had been safety. Here, the memory of the ship's curved hull under his hands was all that kept the taste of fear from turning to madness. The forest pressed closer with each hour. A faint sound rippled through the night. Not wind, not any creature he knew. A scrape, a muffled thud, and then a silence heavier than before. Every man reached for a weapon, the whisper of iron on wood. Breath smoked in the cramped air. Halfdan counted the beats of his heart against the long, unbroken dark. The pelt over the door sagged inward, just a hand's breadth. Then stilled. No one spoke. Snow sifted from the roof poles. Outside, a raven croaked once, and the sound seemed to come from the ground rather than the sky. Halfdan closed his eyes and pictured the hull of the Nar sliding through black water. The way it had always carried them. The way it had always risen from the swell. That was their secret. That was why they never sank. He clung to it as the night pressed in, as the cold gnawed his toes through the damp wool, as the forest whispered of things that would not wait until morning. The fire popped. Something answered from the trees, soft as a footstep on snow. Then came another sound, farther off. A hollow, deliberate knock that echoed like a heartbeat in the frozen air. No one breathed. The forest listened back. The smoke from the sunken hearth stung Halfdan's eyes, though he barely noticed it anymore. It clung to the furs, to the hair of every man crouched in the low, darkened pit they called shelter. A night had passed without sleep, and now the pale light of a cloud-choked dawn barely seeped through the snow-caked pelt that covered the entrance. The forest did not lift its weight from their chests. It had only grown heavier. Rollo's hands shook as he gnawed a strip of sinew, his teeth scraping it clean with a rasping sound that made every man's skin crawl. The meat smelled faintly sour, touched with rot. It had been carried too long under wool and leather. Still, no one complained. Hunger had stopped allowing the luxury of taste. Halfdan crouched near the fire and prodded the coals with a charred stick. Sparks leapt and vanished. He did not look at the men. He listened. Always listening. The forest spoke in ways the sea never did. On the water, you knew the moods of wind and tide. They rose and fell with a rhythm you could trust. Here, there was no rhythm. One moment the trees stood in utter stillness, their snow-laden branches like frozen arms reaching into the dull sky. The next, a soft groan would slide through the woods, as if some hidden beast exhaled between the trunks. Even the crows were gone now. Bjarki crouched at the entrance, his beard rimed with ice, eyes fixed on the seam of light beneath the hanging pelt. He held his axe across his knees as though it might leap from his hands if he did not keep it close. 2 days, he whispered, voice cracked and low. No sign of them, and yet they are here. Halfdan said nothing. He had seen the marks that morning when he crept out to relieve himself. Narrow tracks like the slit hooves of reindeer, but set in patterns too careful, too deliberate. Around one tree, a perfect ring of impressions in the snow, each no wider than his thumb. He had not told the others. Men's hearts cracked under less. They called these forest people Biamians, though Halfdan had never heard the word until last summer. Traders from the Sami coast spoke of them in the dim corners of the market, voices lowered as though the very syllables carried bad luck. A people who could follow a wolf for 3 days without leaving a track, who could sit unmoving in the snow until the sun went down and came up again, who built no houses but burrowed into the ground and hung their dead in the trees like white staring fruit. Halfdan had thought it another trader's tale, but the missing scout, the vanishing footprints, and the sounds in the night had stripped him of doubt. The long winter light deepened to a bruised gray as clouds thickened. Snow began to fall again. Dry, silent flakes that seemed to muffle the world even further. Halfdan licked his lips, tasting blood from cracks that never healed in this cold. His tongue felt thick. He had not drunk more than a mouthful of melted snow since yesterday. A sudden creak above them made every man flinch. A crust of snow slid from the turf roof and hit the drift outside with a soft thump. Halfdan's heart hammered, then slowly eased. He drew a breath through his nose and caught a whiff of smoke and human musk and the sour tang of fiercest. It was a smell he would remember for the rest of his life. When the pelt shifted, it did so without a sound. A thin line of light widened, and a figure stooped into the opening. For an instant, the men tensed to strike, until the stooped shape resolved into Arn, the youngest of their number, his eyes wide and white in the dim. Snow powdered his shoulders and lashes. "They are out there," he said simply, his voice frayed, nearly gone. "I saw, not men, shadows, moving on the snow without breaking it." Rollo spat and crossed himself in a half-remembered gesture to Thor and Odin at once. A man clutching at any god that might listen. "Spirits," he muttered. "They are not spirits," Bjarki said, though his voice trembled under the weight of his own words. "They are hunters, better hunters than us." Halfdan's mind went back to the ship, to the sway and creak of its ribs on the fjord, the surety of the sea beneath him. He had never feared ambushes there. A longship was a moving fortress, a living beast that could flee or strike at will. Out here, every step was a trap, every tree a blind. They were like fish flopping on the ice, waiting for the hand that would not show itself until the spear came down. A hollow knocking rolled through the trees, distant but clear. It was not the rhythm of an axe on wood. It was slower, deliberate, echoing. One knock, then silence. Two knocks. Then the forest swallowed the sound whole. Arn whimpered. No one shamed him for it. As dusk bled toward night again, they agreed that two men must keep watch outside, though every instinct in their bodies screamed to remain under the turf roof. Halfdan drew the lot with Bjarki. Together they crawled out into the open, the snow biting their knees through wool trousers, and crouched in the half-light. The forest before them was a black and white world, all shadow and frost. Their breaths rose in twin plumes. No wind stirred. Halfdan's ears strained against the suffocating quiet. He thought he heard a faint clicking, like teeth on bone, but could not tell from which direction it came. Then, far to the left, a flicker of movement. A pale form sliding between the boles of pine. Halfdan's hand tightened on his spear, his chest filled with a hot surge of hope and dread. But the figure did not approach. It simply stopped, merged with the tree, and disappeared. Bjarki's whisper barely reached him. "They play with us, like cats with mice." Hours dragged. Their toes went numb. The sky cleared enough to show a smear of greenish light. The northern fire, twisting faintly above the treetops. Halfdan thought of the stories told by old men in smoke-filled halls, lights of the dead, of fallen warriors riding the sky. He wondered how many of them had died in forests like this, nameless, their bones hidden under snow. Somewhere behind them, a muffled scream cut short. It was not a battle cry. It was a man's voice turned small and thin by distance and terror. Halfdan did not turn toward the sound. He could not. His legs had locked, and his breath felt trapped in his chest. Bjarki's eyes found his in the pale starlight, and in that silence they both understood. The forest had taken another of their number. Snowflakes spiraled lazily past Halfdan's lashes as he listened to the crushing quiet that followed, wondering if the gods had ever truly walked these woods, or if they, too, had learned to fear what waited in the white. The night did not end so much as it thinned, like smoke leaking through the cracks of a longhouse wall. The light that crept into the forest was gray and hesitant, carrying no warmth, no promise. Halfdan stood knee-deep in snow where he had fallen asleep on his feet, jerking awake when his knees buckled. His joints screamed with cold. Behind him, The sunken shelter smoked weakly from the gap at the roof, the last of the pine coals whispering their death. No one spoke. The silence between the men was as solid as the frost that had sealed their beards into rough nets of ice. Only 5 of them now, where there had been 10 when they had left the ship beached under the cliffs of the fjord. The forest had swallowed the rest without a sound, leaving no blood on the snow, no broken branch to mark the struggle. It was a silence that had its own taste, metallic and thin, clinging to the back of the throat like fear. Halfdan's stomach had stopped growling. Hunger had hardened into a dull ache. When he pressed his tongue to his teeth, he tasted the sourness of his own body turning on itself. He tightened the leather cord of his cloak, though it did little against the breath of wind that slithered down from the high ridges. Snow sifted from the branches with every faint tremor, dusting his shoulders with cold powder. "Move," Bjarki rasped finally, voice brittle as the ice crusting his mustache. "If we stay, we die like rabbits in a snare." None of them argued. They had seen the tracks again at dawn, not where they expected, but around the very lip of the sunken shelter. Tiny depressions, no wider than a man's thumb, in a perfect circle around the pit, as if something had walked the night in silence, studying them, and then left without a sound. Rollo had whispered that they were spirits. Arn had said nothing at all, his eyes hollow, fixed on nothing. They trudged single file into the forest, snowshoes lashed to their boots with leather thongs. The Sami traders had laughed at them when they bought the crude frames last autumn, calling them sea legs on land. Now, with the snow waist-deep in places, Halfdan blessed the dry creak of the wood under his feet. Behind them, the sunken shelter disappeared under a lazy drift, as though the forest had been waiting to erase it. The trees thickened into a black-toothed wall. Frost-coated branches clawed at their cloaks and hoods. Somewhere far off, a woodpecker tapped, the first natural sound they had heard in days. Halfdan's hands were stiff around his spear shaft, fingers clumsy with numbness. He thought of his daughter's hair, the warm weight of her against his chest, and wondered if she would ever know what the forest had done to her father. Then they found it. The body hung above the snow like a forgotten offering. A man, what was left of one, strung up between 2 birches, suspended by his wrists on a crossbeam of lashed poles. His face was gray, lips pulled back from his teeth, and his eyes had frozen open into white stones. From his ribs hung a garland of animal bones. Fox jaws, bird skulls, the slender leg of a hare. The body's feet did not touch the ground. Snow had drifted high around the base of the trees, and in it, faint, deliberate patterns were pressed. Loops, circles, spirals, as if someone had danced there in the night. Rollo gagged and turned away, the sound muffled by his furs. Bjarki's jaw worked silently. No one moved closer. The air smelled of sap and old blood, sharp in the cold. Halfdan's breath hitched in his chest. This was no careless killing. This was a message, a kind of theater. The forest people, Biamians, spirits, whatever they were, wanted them to see this. He could almost feel the gaze of eyes he could not find, peering through the mesh of black branches. "Them that dance for the dead," Bjarki said finally, voice breaking. "I have heard of this. My mother's brother saw such things in the far north. He said they hang their own in the trees, so the spirits can watch the living." Rollo shook his head, lips trembling. "No men do this." Halfdan did not answer. His hands were sweating inside his stiff gloves, a clammy heat that made the cold worse. He felt the world narrowing to the sound of his own breath, the tightness in his chest. Around the hanging body, the snow seemed to swallow all sound, leaving only the faint creak of rope in the frost. Arn stepped forward suddenly, as if drawn by some thread, and reached for the nearest tree. His gloved hand brushed the bark. Then he froze. A thin, almost invisible cord of braided sinew ran from the tree to the next. A snare. His eyes widened, and he jerked back just as a branch above released a small avalanche of snow. Something sharp clattered onto the drift where he had stood. A line of flint flakes bound to a stick, teeth for a silent trap. Halfdan pulled him back by the hood. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard it hurt. The forest was alive with invisible hands. Every tree could kill them if they moved without thought. "Back," he whispered. "Back to the stream bed." They moved like ghosts, every step measured, breath shallow. The body above the snow watched them leave with its ice-stiff eyes. By the time they reached the shallow gully where a frozen stream ran under a crust of snow, the light was already draining from the world again. Halfdan crouched and brushed a hole in the ice to scoop water. The cold bit his fingers like knives, but the sip that followed was life itself, metallic and raw. He forced himself to chew a scrap of dried fish, though it felt like swallowing splinters. The others huddled against the gully wall, and for the first time since leaving the coast, Halfdan felt the weight of despair press fully into his bones. They could not fight an enemy they could not see. They could not sleep. Their bodies were withering under the hunger and the cold. And all the while, the forest pressed in, watching, patient as a wolf circling a wounded deer. As the first stars blinked in the indigo sky, a distant drumbeat rolled through the trees. Soft, deliberate, and slow. It was not the wind. It was not thunder. Each beat seemed to strike directly through the marrow of Halfdan's spine. 1, 2, then silence. Halfdan's hand tightened on his spear until the wood creaked. He realized with a hollow certainty that they were not simply being hunted. They were being watched, measured, and drawn deeper into a ritual older than any story he had ever heard by the firelight of his home fjord. The snow began to fall again, thick and silent, as if to bury the sound. And them with it. The snow swallowed all sound as Halfdan trudged along the streambed, his feet wrapped in rags beneath stiff leather boots, each step slow and deliberate. The night had closed in entirely, and the pale northern fire writhed faintly above the black silhouettes of pines, green and cold against the star-splattered void. It was no comfort. He remembered sitting by the hearth as a boy, listening to the old men call the lights the paths of fallen warriors, the spears and shields of the dead riding the sky. Now the lights felt like eyes, silent and judging, watching him stumble through a world that was no longer his own. Behind him, the remaining 4 men moved without words, their breath steaming from the gaps in their furs. They were shrunken things now, hollow-cheeked and rimed with frost, no longer the proud killers who had left their ship with laughter and steel. Bjarki's steps dragged in the snow, the weight of his age and his weariness pulling at every stride. Arn's hands trembled so violently he had tied his spear to his wrist with a loop of leather, lest it fall into the white and be lost. Rollo muttered to himself, the words slipping out in some half-remembered sing-song prayer. Names of gods blurred with fragments of childhood charms against the dark. They followed the stream until the trees thickened into a kind of barricade. Branches bent low under the snow, forming black, skeletal arches. Halfdan crouched and studied the ground before stepping off the ice. Snow clung to the ridges of his gloves, and he felt the subtle give beneath, the crust hiding air pockets and treacherous voids. A man could vanish in a heartbeat in country like this. He motioned for the others to hold, then eased forward, listening. The forest breathed in its slow, secret rhythm. Somewhere far off, a tree cracked under the weight of ice. A hollow gunshot that rolled through the dark and left the silence deeper than before. Then another sound followed. Softer, nearer. A faint swish, like a pelt brushing against bark. Halfdan froze, hand tightening on his spear shaft. His heart thudded, loud enough he thought the forest must hear it. A shape emerged between the trunks, small, hunched, and white against the darkness. For a heartbeat, he thought it was a child, But the proportions were wrong, the limbs corded with lean strength. Snowshoes spread like webbed paws, and the figure carried a bow of pale wood longer than its own body. The hooded head turned, revealing the edge of a mask, a shard of bone carved into the shape of a snarling fox. And then it was gone, sliding sideways into shadow with no more sound than the fall of a single flake. Rollo made a strangled sound and dropped to one knee, clutching at the small hammer of Thor he wore on a thong. Bjarki only stared into the trees, lips peeled back in a grimace that was not quite a smile. "Witch," he whispered. "The stories were true. They let the women hunt us." Halfdan's throat tightened. He had known women of his own land who swung axes when men were away at sea, who kept farms alive through famine and storm. But this was different. The presence in the forest was not a farmer with a hoe or a shield maiden of saga tales. It was an unblinking force that moved without sound and without fear. It saw them not as men, but as meat. A soft thump cut through the night. Snow fell from a high branch, and something quivered in the white. A shaft of wood fletched with gray feathers. Halfdan jerked back, his shoulder screaming as the arrow buried itself in the snow where his chest had been a blink before. There had been no whistle, no warning. Only silence. Then death arriving like a whispered name. "Back!" he hissed, and they lurched toward the gully wall, hearts pounding. A second arrow struck Rollo's shield with a dull thock, quivering in the pale starlight. They saw nothing but black trunks and snow. No movement, no face. The forest itself was the enemy. Bjarki dropped to a crouch and hissed through his teeth. "We cannot fight shadows. We make for the ship, or we freeze here." Halfdan hesitated. To turn their backs felt like offering their spines to the knives of ghosts. But the ship, the curved ribs of oak resting under its blanket of snow on the frozen inlet, was the only thought that held his mind together. The ship that never sank, the secret that had carried them through every storm. If they could reach it, the forest would lose its teeth. They began the retreat, every step an agony of waiting for the arrow or spear or trap that would end them. The snow was deeper here, and more than once Arn stumbled and fell, his body sinking with a muffled crunch as though the forest were tasting him. They dragged him out by his arms, breathing in sharp, wheezing bursts. His eyes were glassy, wide as a frightened animal's. Then the drumming began. It was so soft at first that Halfdan thought it was his own pulse in his ears. A low, steady thrum, irregular but insistent, like a heart muffled in layers of snow and pine. It seemed to come from all around, vibrating in the soles of their feet. Rollo whimpered and pressed a hand to his chest. The rhythm quickened slightly, then stopped, replaced by the faint crackle of something unseen moving in the treetops. The men bunched together, backs nearly touching, every shadow a threat. Then, from the darkness to their right, a pale figure emerged. It was a woman, or it wore the shape of one. Tall and lean, wrapped in a cloak of stitched ermine pelts, a necklace of bone claws rattling softly at her chest. Her face was hidden by a mask of carved birch painted with streaks of red ochre, the eye holes black and endless. She carried no weapon in her hands. She didn't need to. Halfdan felt his mouth go dry. In her presence, all the world shrank to the hiss of his breath and the hot pulse of his fear. Every tale he had laughed at by the hearth, of witches who commanded wolves, of forest spirits who danced men to death, suddenly lived and breathed before him. The Byamians did not fight like men. They fought like the land itself, patient and cold, striking only when the world had already broken you. The woman tilted her head, a slow, deliberate motion, and a soft sound answered from the left. A crack of a branch, a rustle of snow. Shadows moved. They were surrounded. Bjarki raised his axe in trembling defiance, the muscles in his arm jumping with exhaustion. "Come then," he rasped. "If you are flesh, bleed." The masked woman did not move. Instead, somewhere in the darkness, the drumming resumed. Louder now, a heartbeat that belonged not to one body but to the forest entire. And then, with a whisper like dry leaves, the shadows melted back into the trees, leaving only the sound and the cold. Halfdan realized, with a sick heaviness in his gut, that this was not mercy. It was the hunt stretching itself, savoring the chase. The forest had all the time in the world. They stumbled onward, toward the memory of the sea, the cold gnawing deeper than ever, every step an argument against despair. Behind them, faint in the trees, a single hollow knock rang out, then another, carrying through the night like a promise that they would never leave this place unchanged, if they left at all. The snow along the gully had hardened overnight into a crust that cracked under every step, a brittle rhythm that betrayed them to the forest. Halfdan felt each sound shiver through his bones, a reminder that they no longer belonged here. They were intruders in a place older than their stories, a place that had learned the shape of their fear and now moved to the rhythm of it. The gray of early morning seeped through the branches like thin water through cloth. It offered no warmth, only a deeper view of the endless black pillars of pine and the white drifts piled high against their bases. Halfdan's legs burned with every step, his knees trembling from cold and hunger. His fingers, wrapped in wool stiffened with ice, had long since stopped feeling the spear they clutched. Behind him, the three remaining men trudged in single file. Bjarki still led with his stubborn, bent back, a shadow of the Iron Man he had once been on the fjord. Rollo staggered, muttering half-formed prayers to gods who seemed to have followed the sun south, leaving this land to other powers. Arn brought up the rear, his face hollow and pale, lips cracked and bleeding. His eyes had the glassy, feverish shine of a man walking on the edge of sleep and death. They had left the gully at dawn, driven by the memory of the ship. Their only salvation, their floating hall of oak and iron that had never failed them. In their minds, the curve of its hull and the smell of tar and sea salt was the only barrier between them and the white jaws of the forest. But the sea felt impossibly far now, as if the forest had shifted in the night to swallow the path behind them. Halfdan's ears caught a sound that did not belong, a whisper of wood against wood, faint but deliberate. He froze and lifted a hand. The others stilled instantly, eyes darting. The forest seemed to listen with them. Then it came again. A soft knock, slow and measured, like a craftsman's hammer on distant timber. Bjarki spat into the snow, the saliva freezing almost before it landed. They mock us. They tell us we are already theirs. Halfdan swallowed hard. His tongue was dry, heavy as salted leather. He glanced upward and caught the brief flicker of movement. A pale blur leaping branch to branch, weightless against the snow-laden boughs. He could not see its face, but the tail of a white pelt trailed behind like smoke. A moment later, a second flicker to the left. The Biamians were moving above them, silent hunters in a world where every sound of the Norsemen was an invitation to die. "Keep walking," Halfdan muttered. His voice felt smaller than the trees, swallowed by the air. They trudged on, their breath steaming, hearts pounding. Each step felt like moving deeper into a dream where the rules of the sea and farm no longer mattered. Halfdan's mind, raw with fatigue, began to twist the shapes in the trees into faces. He saw women's eyes in the knots of frozen pine, saw the curve of antlers in branches heavy with ice. He thought of the woman in the mask, the fox face with its black hollows. Her stillness haunted him more than any weapon could. By midday, hunger gnawed like a live thing. They stopped to scrape thin ice from a trickle of water in a hollow log, cupping the melt in shaking hands. Rollo pulled a strip of dried fish from his pouch, only to drop it in the snow when his numb fingers fumbled. He stared at it for a heartbeat, then bent and pressed it to his lips anyway, grit and ice crunching between his teeth. No one laughed. The forest had grown quieter than quiet. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving the world in a suffocating stillness. And then the smell came, faint but sharp, cutting through the cold like a knife. Smoke. Not their own. Halfdan crouched, his instincts from the coast and the raiding life flaring awake despite exhaustion. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant shelter. And shelter meant the enemy. He gestured for the others to follow, creeping toward the scent through the drifts, using tree trunks for cover. His stomach knotted with dread and strange hope. Even danger felt like a relief after endless, formless fear. They found the clearing by crawling on bellies, the snow soaking through furs and wool until the cold bit their skin. Beyond the low brush, a hollow in the forest opened, ringed by leaning birches. Smoke coiled from a pit in the ground, almost invisible against the gray sky. Around it, half buried in snow, rose a cluster of mounds and pits. Not houses, but something older, stranger. Turf roofs and snow-packed walls blended perfectly with the earth. Only the faint trails of steam and the smell of pine smoke betrayed the hidden life beneath. Halfdan's pulse quickened. Biamians. He counted at least 4 mounds, each with a narrow, dark mouth that opened onto the world like a watching eye. A figure emerged from one of the pits. A woman again, tall and wrapped in white furs, her braids streaked with frost. She carried a bundle of firewood in one arm, a curved knife in the other. Behind her, a second figure followed, smaller and stooped, face hidden by a mask of bone shaped like the long snout of a stoat. They moved with unhurried precision, as if the cold did not touch them, as if the forest bent to their will. Rollo's hand tightened on Halfdan's shoulder. His breath shivered against his ear. We cannot fight them. Not here. Not like this. Halfdan knew he was right. Even in their prime, 10 Vikings might have struggled against this world. Now 4 hollowed men stood on the edge of the clearing, half dead already. The Biamians had them penned in the forest like hares in a snare, and he could almost feel the invisible wires of that snare tightening with every heartbeat. A sudden, distant howl split the air. Not a wolf's, but something crafted, a human throat bending sound into terror. It rolled through the forest and back, echoing off the ridges. The woman in the clearing lifted her head, listening, then answered with a sharp, trilling whistle that made Halfdan's teeth ache. Bjarki flinched. It is a game to them, he said hoarsely. A game of the gods. The Biamians disappeared back into their mounds, and for a long time the clearing lay still, smoke curling upward into the dead gray sky. Halfdan realized he was trembling, his entire body quivering like a leaf in winter wind. He had faced steel and storm, had watched men die under his axe without a flinch. But this was a war of patience, of silence, of minds breaking before bodies. As they crawled back into the trees, careful not to leave a single mark more than necessary, the snow began to fall again. Thick, heavy flakes drifted down, erasing their trail almost as soon as it was made. Halfdan glanced upward, watching the sky blur into white, and for the first time since leaving the ship, he felt the edge of hopelessness carve into him. They returned to the gully they had slept in the night before, wordless, hunched against the cold. The daylight was fading already, bleeding into the endless dusk of the far north. Halfdan pressed his back to the frozen earth and closed his eyes, listening to the muted forest, the blood in his ears, and the memory of the ship creaking on black water. A hollow knock rolled through the trees. Once, twice, then silence. Halfdan opened his eyes to the dim world and knew the forest had drawn them into its theater, and the play was not yet done. He tightened his grip on the spear across his chest, as if that simple shaft of wood could anchor him to the life he still clung to, while the white jaws of the Biameans closed ever tighter around his soul. The snow fell in a steady, relentless drift that blurred the world into gray and white, muting all edges, erasing the line between earth and sky. Halfdan trudged through it with the others strung behind him like beads on a broken cord. Their figures bent under the weight of exhaustion. Cloaks and beards frosted hard, the furs of their hoods rimmed in white needles of ice. The forest no longer looked like a place of trees, but like the ribs of some enormous beast, half buried in the drifts, patient and eternal. Halfdan's thoughts had narrowed to three things: the taste of cold iron in his mouth, the ache of hunger like a hollow auger turning in his belly, and the memory of the ship. That memory had become more than oak and tar and iron rivets. It was a talisman, the only warmth left in his mind. He could almost smell the mix of salt water and pine pitch, hear the hollow slap of waves against the hull, feel the gentle rise and fall as the Knar breathed with the sea. He clung to that image as if it were a rope over a black pit. Behind him, Bjarki stumbled and caught himself against a birch, his hands leaving streaks in the frost. The old warrior's face had grown gaunt, eyes sunken, the stubborn light in them dulled to embers. Rollo followed, muttering a raw, cracked prayer under his breath, his hammer amulet clutched tight in a fist that had long since lost its feeling. Arn limped at the rear, eyes glassy, his steps uneven. He had stopped responding to words hours ago. They were not men anymore, not raiders or traders or sons of the fjords. They were prey moving through the trap. A sound drifted through the storm, soft, measured, and wrong. A hollow knock. Then another. Halfdan froze mid-step, the snow whispering around his boots. He held up a gloved hand, and the line of men went still. Breath steamed in the gray air. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate, echoing between the trunks. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. From the trees themselves. Then, through the drifting snow, figures appeared. White against white, their shapes rippled into existence like ghosts stepping out of mist. Biameans. 3 of them at first, then 5, sliding between the trees on long, narrow skis, fur-wrapped feet bound to smooth planks that cut the snow without sound. Each wore a mask. Bone and birch carved into the faces of foxes, stoats, owls. Strips of sinew tied feathers and bits of antler to their braids, which clattered faintly in the wind. They glided in a slow crescent around the Norsemen, always just at the edge of clear sight. Halfdan's heart pounded so hard he thought it might break his ribs. He did not lift his spear. He had learned, over these endless days, that to move first in this white world was to die. He let the snow sting his eyes and watched. One figure drew closer, its mask the long, narrow snout of a fox. A woman by her shape, tall and straight-backed, the cloak of white pelts rippling around her. Her skis hissed softly as she stopped a dozen paces away. The forest wind rattled the bone charms at her throat. She held no weapon in her hands, but Halfdan knew it was not mercy. The drumming began again. Low, slow, like the heartbeat of the forest itself. Somewhere to the left, hidden beyond sight, another Biamean struck wood against wood in a rhythm that seeped into bone. 1 knock. Pause. 2 knocks. A pause long enough to feel like a held breath. Rollo broke. He dropped to his knees in the snow, clutching the amulet to his chest. Odin, Thor, Freya, anyone. His voice cracked into the whiteness and vanished like smoke in wind. The fox-masked woman tilted her head slightly. Then, with a motion smooth as water, she drew a short, recurved bow from her shoulder and an arrow from the quiver at her hip. She knocked it without a word. Halfdan moved then, stepping in front of Rollo, spear raised though his arms shook from weakness. His voice came out hoarse, foreign in his own ears. "We will leave. No more. We will leave." He wasn't sure if she understood his tongue or simply the tone of a man already broken. She held the arrow, bowstring drawn, and for a heartbeat he thought it would end there, with the cold bite of flint in his chest. But instead, she slowly lowered the bow and gestured with 2 fingers toward the south, the direction of the sea. Then she turned and vanished into the snow, her white figure swallowed by the pines as if it had never been. The others followed her silently, gliding away in a line, their skis leaving the faintest marks that the wind quickly began to erase. Only the echo of the knock-knock remained, rolling through the frozen air. Halfdan's knees trembled. His chest heaved with something like relief and terror twisted together. He pulled Rollo to his feet, and together they turned south, moving as fast as their ruined bodies would carry them. They no longer spoke. The forest remained heavy and silent, but the sense of eyes faded, like the lifting of a weight. Hours later, as the light thinned into blue twilight, the trees opened, and the frozen inlet came into view. The Nar lay half buried in snow and rimed with frost, but to Halfdan it was a vision of salvation, dark and solid against the endless white. The memory of the sea seemed to shiver in its timbers. They clawed the snow from the hull with their hands, breath tearing from their throats. Halfdan's fingers bled in the cold, but he didn't stop. By the time the sun vanished behind the ridges, they had freed enough to reach the deck. They clambered aboard like dying men onto a floating hall. That night, huddled under the upturned hull, Halfdan listened to the wind sweep over the inlet. The forest loomed behind them, silent, watchful, eternal. He knew that the Biamians could have killed them all, that the forest itself had decided to let them go. It was not mercy. It was a message. Days later, when they finally caught a wind to carry them south, Halfdan sat in the stern and stared at the white line of the northern coast until it vanished. The ship rode the waves as it always had, the oak strakes flexing, the tarred seams holding, the secret of the Vikings keeping them from ever sinking. But now he understood that there were places even a ship could not save a man from. The white forest, the silent hunt, the eyes that watched from behind the pines. In the longhouse by the fjord, when the fire cracked and the wind howled against the walls, children would sit wide-eyed as Halfdan whispered of the watchers in the white forest. He would tell them of the silence, the masks, the hollow knocks that followed a man in his dreams. And every time the snow fell against the roof, he would feel his hand tighten on the old ship-nail charm around his neck, knowing that even the best ship could only carry a man so far from the land that had already claimed part of his soul.